Hey everybody, it's time for the Wonder of Christmas devotion, and today's topic is Magi. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Matthew 2, 1-2. We see them throughout the Old Testament hanging around the courts of kings, wise men, advisors, Magi. In Genesis, the Egyptian Pharaoh has a strange dream and calls his magicians and wise men to interpret 41:8. In Exodus, another Pharaoh calls his wise men and sorcerers to duplicate the God-given miracles of Moses, 7:11-12. In Esther 1:13, King Xerxes of Persia consults experts and wise men to figure out how to handle his disobedient queen, Esther's predecessor. In the book of Daniel, the Babylonian king has a disturbing dream, which he forgets, and he demands to be told what he dreamt. His advisors protest, but only Daniel can do what the king wants. No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. The Hebrew prophet explains, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries," 2:27-28. Various Hebrew words and Greek renderings are used for these roles. Among them is the Greek magos, from which we get the Latin plural magi. So when Matthew uses this term to describe those who traveled from the east to bring gifts to the newborn king, we have some history. We don't know much about these particular wise ones, but we can make some good guesses. It's quite possible that Matthew's magi were connected to a royal court. This might also explain why they had little trouble getting an audience with Herod. It's interesting that he confers with his own wise men to learn where the child would be born. Popular knowledge of the Magi is pretty much wrong, at least as impressed upon us by the Christmas carol We Three Kings. There is no reason to think that they themselves were kings. The three kings tradition developed later in church history, possibly with reference to certain Old Testament prophecies. See Psalms 68:29, 72:10, and Isaiah 63. And the only reason to think there were three of them is that they brought three gifts. There might have been 2 or 5 or 7 magi who all chipped in on the presents. One early church leader suggested there were 12, but that was a trendy number at the time. They came from the east, which allows for a number of possibilities. Persia had a tradition of magi in the priestly class of its Zoroastrian religion. Babylon had a long-standing reputation for stargazing and wisdom, going back to Daniel and beyond. Some scholars think the gifts came from Arabia, so maybe the Magi did too. This was the east of the Jewish world at the time, not the east we think of now as China and Japan and Korea. The biblical text mentions the house where the Magi visited the child, Matthew 2:11. This challenges the common notion that the Magi were elbowing shepherds in the stable to get a look at the baby Jesus. In fact, the Magi probably came later, maybe when Jesus was a toddler. Herod's order to kill children 2 years old or younger suggests that the Magi showed up 1 to 2 years after Jesus' birth. So they weren't kings, there weren't necessarily 3 of them. They didn't come from the east as we know it, and they weren't huddled around the manger as we like to depict them in our crochet decorations at Christmas. So who were they? Some translations call the Magi astrologers. It's not a bad description since we know they were studying the stars, but we should keep in mind that in most ancient cultures, religion and science were nearly identical. We might consider the Magi astronomers who examine the skies for clues about divine forces. There are many theories about what they saw up there, what made them think it was a royal birth announcement, and how the star led them to the Christ child. We won't get into all that, but clearly the Magi were in the business of reading meaning in heavenly configurations. Also, it's appropriate that God used a dream to dissuade the Magi from returning to Herod. Dream interpretation was in the job description of most Magi. Remember also that Daniel used some prophecies that involve specific timing, periods of years described as weeks, 9:20-27. We're not going to do the math here, but it's possible that the Magi did the numbers and believed that the anointed one described by Daniel would be born in Daniel's homeland in their time. So when they saw the heavenly sign, they knew, game on. Divine prophecies were being fulfilled. They undertook a major journey with expensive gifts based on their conviction that this was a very special event. We might rightly ask the question, what's the spiritual meaning of the Magi? Consider what Matthew is up to. In chapter 1, he acknowledges that Jesus is born out of wedlock. It takes a dream from God to convince Joseph to stay with Mary. Before that, Matthew goes through one branch of Jesus' family tree, including only 4 women, 2 foreigners, and 2 marked by scandal. And here in chapter 2, the Christ child is worshipped by foreign dignitaries who are guided by God but involved in divination, sorcery, and magic, all strongly forbidden in the Jewish law. Clearly, Matthew is not interested in showing how holy everyone is, and he's making a point to include these foreign magi. We might suppose that Matthew is making a point. God remarkably used flawed people and outsiders in his plan to redeem the world. William Chatterton Dix was an English poet and hymn writer. He penned the lyrics to the well-known carol, What Child Is This? But he also wrote a lesser-known Christmas hymn, As With Gladness Men of Old. Notably in this carol, Dix avoided a number of the wise men myths, referring to them only as men of old and never stating how many there were. The hymn is sung to the same familiar tune of For the Beauty of the Earth. The 4th verse is especially poignant in linking us today to the star the Magi followed. Holy Jesus, every day keep us in the narrow way. And when earthly things are past, bring our ransomed souls at last, where they need no star to guide, where no clouds thy glory hide. Preparing for Christmas. The Magi symbolize how the gift of Jesus Christ, salvation itself, is open to everyone, even outsiders. In what areas of life are you an outsider? Where in your times at work and with family do you feel on the outside? Consider the amazing grace of God to include you in his salvation plan. Perhaps in this Christmas season, when you think of the Magi, you might think of yourself likewise as an outsider being beckoned to worship the sun. Lord God of the stars and heavens, thank you for leading me to the Christ child. Thank you for including me in your family. And then there's a little tidbit that says, we like one particular theory about the Magi, though we have to admit it's conjecture. More than 500 years before Jesus' birth, the prophet Daniel so impressed the king of Babylon that he was placed in charge of all its wise men, Daniel 2:48. Presumably, this included the enchanters, diviners, and magi mentioned earlier in that chapter. Is it possible that Daniel began a tradition of scientific and prophetic wisdom in the court of Babylon and later in the Medo-Persian court, and that a society of wise men passed on this tradition through many generations? All right, I hope you guys have a blessed rest of your Friday. Grace says hi. Why is in the video it looks red, but it's not. Must be because of this reflection, but hi, she says hi. She purring. Pray for me. I'm in pain today more than usual, so just keep me in prayer for that and my health and our finances and just people who are struggling this time of year, because some people have it hard. And keep my friend Shannon in prayer. She had a serious surgery yesterday. Everything went smoothly, but she has a long recovery process, so keep her in prayer for her healing and recovery. Pray for the homeless. And yeah, love you guys later.